I was driving east out of Oakland as the sky faded into that dull winter blue that always comes right before dark. The kind of blue that makes everything feel quieter than it really is. The freeway was busy but steady, headlights glowing like a slow river. Everyone heading somewhere warm. I had wrapped gifts stacked neatly on the back seat, a paper bag with the cinnamon pound cake Mom always said she loved, and that familiar knot in my chest that showed up every year around this time. I told myself, like I always did, that this Christmas would be calm, that dinner would be peaceful, that Dad would be in a good mood, that we would all sit at the table, eat too much, and avoid the old arguments. I had said the same thing to myself every December for years, and somehow I still believed it. Napa Valley was a little over an hour away if traffic behaved. I had done this drive so many times that my hands moved on the steering wheel without thinking. I knew which lanes flowed faster, where the road curved, where the radio signal dropped for a second before coming back. The car smelled like coffee and baked sugar from the cake. My phone sat face up in the console, silent. I glanced at it once, then forced myself to look back at the road. I was 33 years old, not a teenager sneaking home late, and yet my stomach still tightened the closer I got to the turnoff that would lead me to Whitmore Ridge. I told myself that was just nerves, just a habit. I thought about Dad in the kitchen, probably checking his watch, already irritated if dinner was not exactly on time. I pictured Mom moving between the stove and the counter, trying to keep everything smooth, trying to keep everyone calm. I imagined Caleb arriving late, smiling, making some joke about traffic, and somehow still being forgiven instantly. I had learned a long time ago not to expect too much from these nights. Just get through them. That had always been my goal. Get through dinner. Go home. Reset. Try again next year. The radio faded into static as I crossed into a stretch of road lined with dark trees. That was when my phone vibrated. Not a call, a voicemail notification. My heart jumped hard enough that my foot eased off the gas without me realizing it. I glanced down and saw Dad's name on the screen. That was strange. Dad never left voicemails. If he wanted something, he called. If he was angry, he called louder. I told myself it was probably something small. A reminder to pick up ice. A complaint about the wine I brought last year. I reached for the phone, then hesitated, letting it buzz once more before tapping it. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. What are you doing while listening right now? Driving, folding laundry, sitting quietly with a cup of coffee. For me, I was driving home for Christmas dinner, thinking I was still holding my family together. If this kind of story resonates with you, feel free to share where you are listening from and stay with me for what comes next. I pressed play. Dad's voice filled the car, flat and cold, like he was reading from a script he had already rehearsed. He said I was not part of the family anymore. He said I should not come back. He said they were moving on without me. There was no anger in his tone, no shouting. No explanation. Just a statement. Final. The message ended. No goodbye. No pause. Just silence. I pulled over without thinking. Hazard lights blinking against the dark. Cars rushed past me, wind rocking the car slightly as they went by. But inside, everything felt still. I stared at the dashboard, then at the phone in my hand. I listened to the voicemail again, slower this time, as if my brain needed proof that I had not imagined it. The words landed the same way. Calm. Certain. Decided. I waited for the rush of emotion. The tears, the shaking hands, the sharp pain in my chest. None of it came. Instead, I felt something settle in my shoulders, like a weight I had been carrying finally slid off. That scared me more than anger would have. I realized, sitting there on the side of the freeway, that this was not Dad losing his temper. This was not a fight that would blow over by morning. This was a line being drawn, and it had been drawn carefully. I thought back over the past year, over the past several years, and suddenly a lot of small moments lined up in my mind. Conversations that ended abruptly, emails that went unanswered, decisions made without looping me in. I had felt the distance growing, even if I had not wanted to name it. Adam had already moved on in his head. This voicemail was just the formal announcement. My phone buzzed again. A text from Mom. Just a single line asking if I had heard from Dad. I did not reply. I could not yet. I needed a moment to understand what had just been taken from me and what had just been given back. The night air pressed in through the cracked window, cold and sharp. I breathed it in slowly. I looked at the gifts in the back seat, the cake, the carefully chosen wrapping paper, all the small efforts I had made to show up, to be part of something that clearly no longer wanted me. I thought about the dinners I had hosted, the crises I had quietly handled, the checks I had written without telling anyone. None of it mattered now, or maybe it mattered more than I had ever allowed myself to admit. I turned off the engine. The sudden quiet rang in my ears. For the first time in years, I did not feel like I was late. I did not feel like I was letting anyone down. I felt suspended between two choices, and one of them no longer existed. Going back was no longer an option. That door had been closed for me. I sat there until the blinking lights reflected off the road signs and the traffic thinned. I could still make it to Napa if I wanted to. I could still knock on the door, pretend I had not heard the voicemail, smooth things over. I knew exactly how to do that. I had done it my entire life. But as I held the phone in my hand, I knew that if I turned the key and kept driving, nothing would change. Not really. I started the car again, but instead of merging back onto the freeway toward Whitmore Ridge, I stayed on the shoulder for a moment longer. My hands rested on the wheel, steady. My breathing was calm. I turned off the hazard lights. Then I signaled, merged back into traffic, and continued forward. Not toward Napa, but toward the next exit. Away from the house on the hill. Away from the dinner table. Away from the version of myself that kept hoping this time would be different. I did not call Dad back. I did not leave a message of my own. I let the silence sit where his words had been. As the freeway stretched ahead of me, I understood something with a clarity I had never felt before. That voicemail was not the end of something small. It was the beginning of a reckoning I had avoided for years. And for the first time, I did not turn around. But my mind did. As the road carried me away from Napa, memories rose up quietly, one after another, like they had been waiting for permission. Christmas has always done that to me. Even when I tried to move forward, it pulled me backward, back into rooms filled with familiar smells and unspoken rules, back into versions of myself that learned early how to stay useful without taking up space. I could picture the house exactly the way it always looked in December. The long driveway curving up the hill, the porch light glowing warm against the cold, the wreath Mom hung every year slightly crooked, no matter how carefully she adjusted it. I was almost always the first one there. I liked arriving early. Or at least I told myself I did. It gave me something to do. I would set my bag down, roll up my sleeves, and ask what needed help. Mom would glance over her shoulder and say she was glad I came early, then hand me a list without really looking at me. Those afternoons followed the same rhythm every year. I chopped vegetables, laid out serving dishes, and wiped down counters that were already clean. I moved through the kitchen quietly, listening to the hum of the oven and the faint holiday music playing in the background. Dad would pass through once or twice, checking his phone, asking if the roast was ready yet, rarely directing the question at me. When he did speak to me, it was usually to ask me to carry something heavy or fix something small. A loose cabinet hinge, a printer that would not connect, things I was good at, things that did not require much conversation. Caleb usually arrived later. He always had a reason. Traffic, a meeting that ran long, a friend who needed a favor. When he walked in, the energy in the room shifted. Dad's voice lifted. Mom's shoulders relaxed. Caleb would grin, kiss Mom on the cheek, and say something light that made everyone laugh. Someone would take his coat. Someone would offer him a drink. I would still be at the counter, hands damp from washing dishes, watching the scene like it was happening behind glass. Gift exchanges were never dramatic, but they were telling. My presents were often placed together off to the side, opened after the main excitement had passed. Adam would nod and say something polite. Mom would smile and say she hoped I liked it. Caleb's gifts came with commentary, stories about why something had been chosen, jokes about how expensive or hard to find it was. I learned not to flinch when my gifts felt like afterthoughts. I told myself it did not matter, that I was too old to care, but each year, something small settled into my chest. and it never fully left. I was rarely asked about my plans, my hopes, my future. If someone did ask, it was usually in passing, a quick question while walking from one room to another. Caleb, on the other hand, was asked in detail. What he was working on, where he saw himself next year, whether he was happy. Dad leaned in when Caleb spoke. He nodded. He listened. I listened too, even when no one was speaking to me. I learned early that my role during holidays was not to be celebrated, but to be reliable. I remembered one Christmas, when the sink clogged right before dinner. Everyone else froze. I grabbed a towel, crawled under the cabinet, and fixed it, while Dad paced the kitchen complaining about timing. When I emerged, wet and slightly embarrassed, Mom thanked me briefly and handed me a serving spoon. No one mentioned it again. Dinner went on. The crisis passed. That was always how it went. The year that stayed with me the most was Christmas in 2021. I had driven up early again, snow dusting the edges of the vineyard road, the air sharp and clean. I arrived before noon to help Mom prepare. The table was already set in the dining room, polished wood shining under soft light. There were place cards laid out carefully, small and elegant. I noticed my name was closest to the kitchen door. I did not say anything. I never did. As guests arrived, laughter filled the house. Glasses clinked. God poured wine generously. I moved back and forth between rooms, carrying trays, refilling dishes, doing what needed to be done. At some point, Mom pulled me aside. She spoke softly, her voice careful, and said it would be easier if I switched seats. She said it with a smile, like she was asking a small favor. The kitchen seat would make it easier to keep things moving. I nodded and picked up my place card without hesitation. I watched everyone else sit down at the long table. Dad at the head, Caleb across from him, relaxed and confident. Guests leaning in toward each other, raising glasses. I set my plate down at the smaller side table near the kitchen, close enough to hear the conversation, but far enough to feel separate from it. From where I sat, I could see Dad lift his glass and make a toast. He spoke about family, about tradition, about how lucky we all were to be together. I chewed my food slowly, listening to the sound of laughter drift toward me. I stood up when someone needed something, then sat back down again. No one asked me to join the table once things settled. No one noticed when I finished eating. At some point, I realized I was eating alone on Christmas without anyone having explicitly told me I should be. It had simply happened, the way it always did. That night, as I washed dishes long after everyone else had moved into the living room, I caught my reflection in the window. I looked tired, older than I felt. I remember thinking that something about that picture felt wrong, but I could not name it yet. I told myself that families were complicated, that not every role was visible, that someone had to keep things running. Each Christmas followed a similar pattern. Different decorations, different menus, same quiet messages. Show up early, stay helpful, do not ask for too much. I told myself I was choosing this, that I liked being needed, that I was strong enough not to need attention. I told myself a lot of things. Sitting in my car now, the hum of the road steady beneath me, those memories did not feel harmless anymore. They lined up too neatly. The voicemail from Dad did not come out of nowhere. It was the final sentence in a conversation that had been happening for years, without words. Every moved place card, every gift set aside. Every time I was asked to step out of the way so things would run more smoothly. I realized I had spent every Christmas proving that I belonged by making myself smaller, by choosing convenience over presence, by telling myself that love looked like effort, even when effort was the only thing I was offering. I had mistaken endurance for connection. As the miles passed, I asked myself a question I had avoided for a long time. Not angrily, not bitterly, just honestly. Why did I keep coming back every Christmas? The answer followed me into the next thought, and it had nothing to do with tradition or hope. I came back because I had trained myself to fix things. And once you become the person who fixes everything, people stop asking whether you should have to. That instinct did not live only inside the walls of my parents' house. It had seeped into Whitmore Ridge cellars the same way water seeps into wood, slow and quietly, until the structure depends on it. From the outside, the vineyard looked like a family success story. Dad was the owner, Mom curated the image. Caleb smiled for photos and talked about the brand like it was a living thing. People who visited the tasting room saw rolling hills, polished wood, and a family that looked unified and proud. What they did not see was the back office, the cramped room with no windows, the desk pushed against a wall, the old chair that never quite adjusted right. They did not see spreadsheets open late at night, rows of numbers blurring together after hours of staring. They did not see emails marked urgent that arrived after dinner and before dawn. They did not hear the low hum of anxiety that never fully left my chest once I understood how fragile everything really was. Adam liked to say he trusted his gut. He talked about vision and instinct, and how numbers could not capture what really mattered. He spoke about the land like it responded to confidence alone. Mom focused on appearances. She cared about how things felt, how they looked, how people talked about us. She noticed the lighting, the music, and the glassware. Caleb focused on attention. He knew how to pose, how to smile, how to talk about hard work without ever doing much of it. None of them wanted to deal with the unglamorous parts of running a business. That part fell to me. I managed the cash flow, I set up payroll systems, I tracked invoices, due dates, and late fees. I negotiated contracts with distributors and service providers who had learned to call me directly, because I was the only one who returned emails. I handled insurance renewals and compliance paperwork that Dad waved away as boring. When something broke, I fixed it. When something went unpaid, I found a way to cover it. I was not given a title that matched what I did. I was simply expected to handle it, quietly and competently. The first time I used my own money to save the vineyard was in 2018. I remember the day clearly because it felt like a turning point even then. I was 27, newly settled into my apartment in Oakland, trying to build a life that felt like my own. The place was small but clean, with a view of a brick wall and just enough light to make it feel hopeful. I was saving for a better car. I was talking about taking a trip I had postponed for years. I had started to believe that my future might finally belong to me. Then my phone rang in the middle of a workday. It was the operations manager at the vineyard, his voice low and tight. He did not waste time on pleasantries. He told me the power company had sent a final notice. The irrigation system was days away from being shut off. If the pumps stopped, the vines would suffer, maybe permanently. The bill was overdue, and Dad was unreachable. I tried calling Dad myself, stepping into a quiet hallway at work. No answer. I texted. Nothing. I asked how much the bill was, already bracing myself. When he told me the amount, I felt my stomach drop. The number sat heavy in my mind, impossible to ignore. I sat down at my desk and opened my banking app, staring at my savings. It was almost exactly what I had put aside. Every practical part of me knew this was not my responsibility. I had not agreed to cover utilities. I did not own the vineyard. I was not even officially employed there in any meaningful way, but every emotional part of me knew what would happen if I said no. The pumps would shut down. The vines would suffer. The season would be ruined. David would be furious. Mom would be devastated. Caleb would disappear. And somehow, despite all logic, it would still be my fault for not stepping in. I had seen that story play out too many times already. So I transferred the money. I remember my hand shaking slightly as I pressed confirm. I remember the strange mix of relief and dread that followed. I told myself it was a loan, that it was temporary, that it would be acknowledged. I did not tell anyone right away. I waited until that night, when I finally reached Dad. I explained what had happened, carefully, calmly, choosing my words the way I always did around him. He laughed it off. He said cash flow was tight. He said he would take care of it tomorrow. He thanked me in the way someone thanks a clerk who stays late, not a partner who just saved the business. He poured himself a glass of wine while we talked. He sounded relaxed. He never paid me back. That should have been my warning. Instead, it became a pattern. Over the next 6 years, I quietly covered gaps like that again and again. Not always with the same urgency, but with the same result. Sometimes it was a supplier threatening to stop shipments. Sometimes it was a tax payment coming due sooner than expected. Sometimes it was payroll falling short because too much had been spent elsewhere. Every month, when the books did not balance, I made them balance. When payroll came up short, I made sure checks went out on time. When a vendor threatened to walk, I smoothed it over, my voice calm even when my chest felt tight. I tracked it once, out of curiosity more than concern. Late one night, after transferring yet another amount from my personal account, I added everything up. On average, I was funneling about 35% of my income back into the vineyard. Seeing the number written down made my throat ache. That was money I could have used to build a life, to save, to rest, to feel secure. Instead, it disappeared into a business that treated it like background noise. I lived simply. I drove an old car that rattled when it idled too long. I bought groceries carefully. I skipped vacations and smiled when friends talked about theirs. I told people I was busy when I was really just exhausted. I told myself this was temporary, that once things stabilized, I would ease off. That once Dad listened, once Caleb stepped up, once the next season hit just right, things would change. They never did. Dad spent money like confidence alone could replace planning. New equipment that looked impressive but strained the budget. Updated trucks that were justified as necessary. Renovations that photographed well but did nothing for sustainability. Mom pushed for upgrades that made the brand feel more luxurious. New linens, better lighting, redesigned spaces that impressed guests for an afternoon. Caleb traveled for promotional events that were never properly budgeted. He talked about exposure and influence and future returns. Everyone assumed the money would be there, because it always was. They never asked where it came from. There were moments when I tried to explain. I would bring up numbers casually, slipping them into conversations like warnings wrapped in kindness. I would mention margins, timing, risk. Dad waved me off. He said I worried too much. Mom told me not to be negative. Caleb joked that I was the serious one, the responsible one. They all smiled, relieved that someone else was handling it. I worked late nights at my kitchen table, the glow of my laptop lighting the room while the rest of the city slept. I balanced accounts while listening to the hum of traffic outside my window. I answered emails from suppliers and staff while eating dinner over the sink. Sometimes I drove up to Napa on weekends to fix things in person. I walked the property in boots, checking systems Dad had forgotten about. I learned the rhythms of the place, the seasons, the soil, the small details that made or broke a harvest. I knew the vineyard better than anyone who claimed to own it. And still, I was treated like support staff. Useful. Replaceable. Expected to be there without needing recognition. When decisions were made, I was often the last to know. When credit was given, it rarely reached me. When something went wrong, my phone rang. I told myself I was doing this because I cared about the land, because I believed in what the vineyard could be, because family meant stepping up when things got hard. Those reasons sounded noble enough to drown out the quieter truth. I was afraid that if I stopped fixing things, everything would fall apart. And if everything fell apart, I would lose whatever fragile place I still had. I realize now that I had confused being needed with being valued. As long as I kept the lights on and the checks clearing, I belonged, or so I thought. As I drove through the dark, those years lined up behind me like receipts I had never totaled. Every transfer, every late night, every problem was absorbed, so no one else had to feel the weight of it. I had not been staying because I was loved. I had been staying because I was effective. That realization settled into me with a quiet finality. I had not been kept close because I was a daughter. I had been kept close because I solved problems. And once Dad decided I was no longer useful, cutting me off was easy. The road stretched ahead, smooth and indifferent. I kept driving, my hands steady on the wheel, knowledge that something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer asking why they treated me this way. I was starting to understand how they always had, but at the time, I did not yet understand how dangerous that understanding would become. Back then, I still believed that loyalty could protect me. That belief followed me into a quiet office building in downtown Oakland on a warm afternoon in 2022. When I finally agreed to meet with a lawyer I had been avoiding for months. Her name was Judith Carver. She came highly recommended by a colleague who noticed how often I seemed distracted and tired. Judith specialized in business liability and family-owned operations. I remember hesitating before scheduling the appointment, telling myself it was unnecessary. I told myself I was being dramatic, but something inside me had already begun to worry. even if I refused to name it. Judith's office was calm in a way that felt intentional. Neutral walls, learned lines, a large window that let in steady light. She offered me water and waited until I sat down before speaking. There was no rush in her movements, no urgency in her tone. She asked me to tell her everything, and she listened without interrupting. I explained the structure of the vineyard, how Dad owned it outright, how Mom handled the image and events, how Caleb represented the brand publicly. I explained my role, careful at first, then more honestly as the words started to come easier. I talked about cash flow, payroll, contracts, personal money covering business expenses. I downplayed how often it happened. I tried to make it sound reasonable. Judith did not react the way I expected. She did not scold me. She did not look shocked. She nodded slowly and asked questions that cut directly to the core. Whose name was on the credit line? Who signed as guarantor? Who held the liquor license? When I answered those questions, I felt a strange tightening in my chest. She leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. She told me, calmly and clearly, that I was exposed. More than exposed. She explained that I was personally liable for approximately $180,000 in outstanding credit obligations tied to the vineyard. She explained that the California liquor license was in my name, not the company's. She explained that if the business failed, creditors would not go after Dad first. They would come to me. I remember staring at her, convinced I had misunderstood. I told her Dad would never let it go that far. I told her the vineyard had value. Land. Inventory, reputation. Judith nodded again, patient, but her eyes stayed steady. She told me that value did not protect me if the business collapsed suddenly or was mismanaged. She told me that goodwill did not stop lawsuits. She told me that the family did not override contracts. She pulled out a yellow legal pad and wrote things down as she spoke. It made everything feel more real. She explained scenarios I had never allowed myself to imagine. Payroll lawsuits, vendor claims, regulatory penalties if the license was misused. She told me that if something went wrong, I could lose my savings, my income, or even face legal consequences. She said this without drama, just facts. I felt defensive at first. I told her Dad trusted me. I told her he appreciated what I did, even if he did not always say it. I told her this was temporary. Judith listened, then asked me a question that stopped me cold. She asked what would happen if Dad decided I was no longer needed. I laughed, short and uneasy. I said that would not happen. She did not argue with me. She simply asked how many times I had seen people change once money or control was involved. She asked how often she had seen adult children absorb risk for family, businesses, only to be blamed when things fell apart. Then she told me what she wanted me to do. She wanted me to prepare an exit file, not to use, just to have. Documents that would allow me to revoke my personal guarantee. Paperwork to surrender the liquor license if I was no longer involved. Notices that would formally remove me as an agent for the business. She called it protection. She said it was like keeping an umbrella in the car, even when the forecast looked clear. I resisted immediately. The idea felt disloyal, extreme. I told her Dad would see it as a betrayal. Judith did not flinch. She said protection was not betrayal. She said boundaries were not punishment. She said I could love my family and still protect myself. I told her I did not plan to use it. I told her I just wanted to understand my risks. She said understanding without preparation was a gamble. Still, she agreed to draft the documents and place them in a secure file. She asked me to sign them, not to execute them, just to acknowledge their existence. I signed with a knot in my stomach. As I left her office that day, I felt unsettled. The city noise felt louder. The sunlight is harsher. I told myself I had overreacted by coming. I told myself lawyers always assumed the worst. I told myself my situation was different. On the drive home, I rehearsed conversations I never planned to have, explaining this to Dad, reassuring Mom. I imagined Dad laughing it off, telling me not to worry. I imagined him saying he had everything under control. That imagination felt comforting. It felt safer than reality. I never told Dad about the meeting. Life continued the way it always did. The vineyard kept running. Problems kept arising. I kept fixing them. Every time I logged into an account or signed a document, I felt a flicker of awareness I had not had before. I know more now. I knew what I was risking, but I also knew how deeply I wanted to believe it would never come to that. There were moments when Judith's voice echoed in my mind, usually late at night, when I stared at numbers that did not add up, or when Dad dismissed my concerns with a wave of his hand, or when Mom accused me of being negative. Those moments passed, pushed aside by habit and hope. I told myself that Dad would never abandon me, that even if we argued, even if things got tense, he would not cut me off. I told myself that family meant something unbreakable. I clung to that belief because the alternative was terrifying. Looking back, I can see how clearly Judith saw what I refused to. She saw risk where I saw responsibility. She saw exposure where I saw loyalty. She saw a future I did not want to imagine. I kept the exit file exactly where she told me to. Locked. Unused. A precaution I believed I would never need. Every time I thought about it, I felt a twinge of guilt, like I had already betrayed something just by preparing. I told myself Dad would never let it go that far. That belief stayed with me, solid and unquestioned, right up until the night my phone buzzed on the freeway. But that night, as I sat behind the wheel with the sound of the freeway humming around me, I realized he already had. The voicemail was still echoing in my ears when another notification blinked onto my phone. The subject line appeared like a quiet explosion on the screen, its sharp black text cutting through the dark interior of the car. Termination notice. Effective immediately. For a second, I thought maybe it was a mistake. Some automated message sent an error. A glitch in the company system. I slowed down, pulled into the emergency lane, and let the car idle under the harsh orange glow of the overhead lights. The engine hummed softly as I opened the email. The message was short, painfully formal, and completely impersonal. Effective immediately, your services with Whitmore Ridge Cellars are terminated due to lack of loyalty and an ongoing pattern of behavior inconsistent with the family's vision. Please return all company property by the end of the week. Below that, I saw the recipient list. Dozens of names. Every department head, every supplier contact, every intern. It wasn't just a firing. It was a public humiliation. I stared at it for a long time, scrolling up and down as if more context might appear. But it didn't. That was the whole message. No explanation, no discussion, no emotion. Just those words. Lack of loyalty. I said it out loud, testing the sound of it in the stillness. My own voice came out softer than I expected. That phrase had followed me my entire life, but never like this. I had spent years proving loyalty, bending it until it looked like devotion, reshaping myself to fit their version of family, and now it had become my sentence. I should have been angry. I should have cried. I should have felt betrayed. But what I felt instead was silence, a heavy, still kind of silence that filled my chest like fog. The strangest part was that it didn't hurt the way I thought it would. It wasn't painful. It wasn't even a shock. It was a relief, pure, bone-deep relief. For the first time in almost a decade, there was nothing left for me to fix. No numbers to balance, no crises to solve, no endless phone calls from Mom asking why the tasting room payroll hadn't gone through yet. No messages from Caleb asking me to wire money for some marketing trip that was really just a vacation. I didn't have to explain anything anymore. I leaned back in the seat, staring at the dashboard lights until they blurred. Somewhere in the distance, a semi-truck groaned past, shaking the car slightly as it sped by. The air outside was cold, but I didn't feel it. They had just erased me. I scrolled to the bottom of the email, half expecting a line that said, "Merry Christmas," or something equally cruel. But there was nothing. Just Dad's name typed in that stiff, old-fashioned font he always used, followed by his signature block. It made me think of all the years I had spent formatting his emails for him, rewriting his rambling sentences into clean, professional notes. I had probably created that very template. Now it was being used to erase me. The irony made me laugh once. Just once. A small, breathless sound that came out more like disbelief than humor. I set the phone down on the passenger seat and looked out through the windshield. The exit to Napa was coming up on my right, the sign glowing green against the darkness. I would drive up the hill to the vineyard, park in the gravel lot, and walk inside pretending we were still a family. I would bring the gifts I picked out carefully. The pie Mom liked, the nice wine glasses I bought when the old ones chipped. Every year I would tell myself, maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time, Dad would look at me and see me as more than a convenient solution to his mistakes. Maybe Mom would thank me for what I did behind the scenes instead of criticizing how I looked tired or quiet. Every year, I arrived early, helped set the table, took photos for social media, fixed the broken espresso machine, or ironed the napkins because no one else thought to. Every year, I was the first one there and the last one to leave. And every year, I drove away exhausted, promising myself I wouldn't go back. Until I did. But not this time. The green exit sign flashed past, and I kept driving straight. No hesitation. No glance in the rearview mirror. No guilt. I drove until the lights of the city came into view again, stretching like a quiet constellation ahead of me. I turned the radio on, not to any particular station, just to fill the silence. The voice of some late-night DJ murmured about Christmas traffic and love, songs, and for the first time, I didn't feel part of any of it. It was strange how quickly the mind adjusts to freedom once you stop fighting. By the time I reached my apartment in Oakland, it was past midnight. The parking lot was nearly empty, the world already asleep in holiday peace. I sat for a while, engine off, headlights fading, and stared at the dark outline of my building. My phone was still on the passenger seat. More messages had come in, some from Mom, some from staff. I didn't check them. I grabbed my bag, stepped out into the cold, and felt the air hit my face like clarity. For years, I had driven home from that vineyard feeling drained, angry, or numb. This was the first time I walked inside my apartment and felt still. The quiet was startling. No hum of office printers. No phones ringing. No smell of cork and fermentation clinging to my clothes. I turned on the lamp in the living room. The soft yellow light made the space feel smaller, safer. On the counter, a half-eaten slice of pie sat under plastic wrap from the night before. I had planned to bring the rest to Mom's dinner. I opened it, took a forkful, and laughed softly to myself. It wasn't great, but it was mine. I poured a glass of water, sat on the couch, and finally opened my phone again. I reread the email, slower this time. The words looked almost fragile now, stripped of their authority. Lack of loyalty. Family vision. Terminated, effective immediately. The longer I stared at them, the more absurd they felt. He thought he was firing an employee. He thought he was cutting off a problem. He had no idea what he had actually done. I glanced toward the closet where the small safe sat behind a stack of old boxes. Inside was the folder Judith had made for me 2 years ago. I hadn't touched it since that day in her office. I had told myself I never would. Now I wasn't so sure. I took another sip of water and leaned back, letting my head rest against the couch. I imagined Dad sitting at his desk, satisfied. Maybe Mom beside him, proud that they had handled me. Maybe Caleb is pretending to be supportive, already angling for what he could take over. They probably thought the business would be fine without me. They had no idea how much of it was held together by my name, my signature, my guarantees. They had no idea how many systems ran under my accounts, how many contracts required my approval, how many licenses were legally tied to me. I wasn't just an employee. I was the scaffolding. And now, they had just knocked it loose. I didn't feel vengeful that night. Not yet. What I felt was an overwhelming sense of stillness. It was like a storm had passed, and for the first time, I could hear the quiet. I set the phone face down on the coffee table and stared at the ceiling. The Christmas lights outside blinked faintly through the window, reflections catching the glass. Somewhere down the block, someone was playing old holiday music. The faint melody of Silent Night drifted through the air. I thought about what Dad said in the voicemail, how final it sounded, how empty of emotion. You are not our family. Don't come back. Maybe he believed that. Maybe they all did. But I realized, sitting there alone, that family wasn't what they said it was. It wasn't about blood or obligation. It was about presence, respect, mutual care. And none of that had existed between us for a long time. I finished my water, rinsed the glass, and placed it upside down in the sink. Then I walked to my bedroom, unzipped my bag, and saw the unopened gifts I had planned to bring to the vineyard. A book Caleb had mentioned wanting. I left them there. I crawled into bed, still in my jeans, and stared at the ceiling. I thought sleep would be impossible, but it came easier than expected. For once, I didn't fall asleep thinking about what needed to be fixed in the morning. They thought firing me was easy. They thought they had just gotten rid of a burden. What they didn't know yet was that they had just removed the one person holding everything together. And the moment I closed my eyes, I knew something they didn't. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of theirs unraveling. When I woke up, the room was still dark. The digital clock beside the bed glowed faintly. 4:30 in the morning. Christmas Day. The kind of hour when even the city feels half asleep. I lay there for a while, listening to the hum of the heater and the faint sound of wind outside their window. For a moment, I forgot what day it was. Then my eyes landed on the bag by the closet, the one with the unopened gifts, and everything came back. The voicemail, the email, the silence that followed. I sat up slowly, every movement deliberate. My chest felt heavy, but steady, the kind of heaviness that comes not from panic, but from clarity. The house was still. No phone calls, no messages. I reached for my phone anyway, out of habit. There were 29 missed calls, 10 new emails, 3 messages from Mom, all unread. I didn't open any of them. Instead, I stood, crossed the room, and opened the closet. In the far corner, behind a stack of old paperwork and winter coats, sat a small, black safe. It wasn't large, just big enough to hold a few folders and a hard drive. I had not opened it since the day Judith gave me the documents. The key was still in the drawer beside my bed. I found it easily, the metal cool against my palm. I hesitated for 1 second, my thumb resting on the lock, then turned it. The sound of the latch releasing was sharper than I expected, echoing faintly in the quiet apartment. Inside were exactly what I remembered: 2 labeled folders, a flash drive, and a letter from Judith in her crisp, tidy handwriting. The folder marked Withdrawal Contingency was on top. I pulled it out, set it on the table, and sat down. The pages were organized neatly, everything in her methodical order. Legal notices, license transfer forms, a revocation of personal guarantees, step-by-step instructions for freezing business credit access, every detail accounted for, every contingency imagined. When I had signed those papers 2 years ago, I never thought I would use them. Now they felt like a map I had once drawn for a storm I didn't believe would come. I opened my laptop and logged into my accounts. The screen filled with dashboards and notifications, numbers and names I knew by heart. My access still worked. David hadn't revoked anything yet. I could see everything: the vineyard's operating account, the line of credit, the automatic payments queued for the end of the week. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the screen. I wasn't angry. I wasn't shaking or crying. What I felt was something cleaner than that, a simple, quiet understanding of what needed to be done. This wasn't revenge. This was math. Dad had always assumed the vineyard was untouchable because I never said no. He built that confidence on my silence, my reliability, my willingness to clean up the mess before it got noticed. But every safeguard, every license, every account that kept that illusion alive was still tied to me. Judith Nace's letter came with a line I had underlined back then. You are not obligated to keep something standing if it is built on your name, but not your safety. I opened the folder and followed her checklist carefully. Step 1. Revoke digital authorization on the company credit line. It took me less than 3 clicks. A warning box popped up, bright red. Confirm account freeze? This action cannot be reversed without primary guarantor authorization. That was me. I hovered over the button for a long breath, not because I doubted myself, but because I understood exactly what it meant. Freezing the line would halt every automatic payment, every payroll deposit, every supplier order. It would paralyze the entire operation within hours. I clicked confirm. The screen refreshed, then displayed a banner in bold letters: credit line frozen. The word froze there, bright and final. Step 2. Suspend the liquor license. I logged into the California Department of Alcoholic Beverage Control portal. My credentials still worked. The license number blinked back at me. My name right beside it. Clara Whitmore, license holder, Napa County. I scrolled down to the voluntary surrender section and clicked Begin. Another warning popped up. Surrendering this license will suspend the ability to legally distribute or sell alcohol under this registration. I took another breath. In the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed softly. Outside, a car passed, its headlights cutting across the curtains. I thought of the vineyard, the rows of vines, the tasting room, the people who would show up in a few hours thinking they still worked for a family business. They didn't. They worked for my father's ego, powered by my liability. I clicked Submit. The page froze for a moment, then refreshed. The words appeared at the top. License surrendered, pending verification. Step 3. Notify the financial institution of guarantor withdrawal. Judith had drafted the email template for me. All I needed to do was fill in the date and attach the documents. I copied the message, adjusted the date to December 25th, and hit send. It was done. There was no dramatic rush of power, no sense of triumph, just stillness. I sat there, watching the notifications roll in. Confirmation emails, automated responses, a verification code for the freeze. The system was already reacting, gears locking into place. For years, I had been the invisible backbone of that entire business, and now, with a few quiet clicks, I had stopped it from standing on my back any longer. I closed the laptop and sat in silence. The clock on the stove read 5:15. My hands were steady. My breathing is slow. The faint smell of rain drifted in through the cracked window. I imagined Dad waking up in a few hours, checking his accounts, realizing nothing worked. The panic that would ripple through the staff, the confusion when the vendors called, Mom's voice, shrill and blaming, as if any of it surprised her. They would think I was punishing them. But I wasn't. I was protecting myself from the collapse they had built and refused to see coming. For a while, I just sat there, my elbows resting on the table, eyes on the dark window. The city outside was still quiet, the world still caught between night and morning. The glow of my laptop screen reflected faintly in the glass, my own face looking back at me. I didn't look victorious. I looked tired. Not the kind of tired sleep fixes, the kind that comes after you've carried something too long and finally set it down. The folder lay open beside me, papers spread out neatly, every signature, every date, every detail precise. Judith had thought of everything. She had seen this outcome long before I did. I thought of her words again. Protection is not betrayal. I believed that now. Completely. I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and poured a cup of coffee. The first light of morning was beginning to touch the edge of the sky, faint gray against the clouds. I took a sip, the warmth grounding me. On the laptop, another notification appeared, the one that marked the end of it all. Account restrictions active, credit line frozen. I stared at those words, letting them sink in. It was over. No celebration, no anger, just stillness. For the first time in years, nothing was waiting for me to fix it. The quiet, steady realization felt like the truest kind of peace. When I finally opened my eyes again, daylight was already filling the room. It took me a few seconds to realize I had fallen asleep on the couch. The mug from earlier still sat on the table beside the laptop, now cold, a faint ring of coffee staining the wood. The light coming through the window was soft and gray, the kind that only comes after a night of rain. For a moment, I didn't move. The silence of the apartment wrapped around me like a blanket. No buzzing phone, no early calls from the vineyard, no to-do list waiting in my head. Just quiet. I felt the faint ache of exhaustion in my body, but it was a clean kind of tired, not the restless fatigue that had followed me for years. When I finally reached for my phone, I saw the number before I even unlocked it. 29 missed calls. I didn't need to guess who they were from. The notifications stacked one after another, like a parade of urgency I didn't belong to anymore. Staff members, vendors, a few names I recognized from the vineyard's payroll. I scrolled past them slowly, my thumb moving with detached calm. Only 3 names made me stop. Dad, Mom, Walter Haynes. Walter had been our family's attorney for nearly 20 years. I had known him since I was a teenager. The man with the polite smile and the habit of calling me kiddo long after I stopped being one. He handled the vineyard's contracts, tax filings, and estate matters. The kind of man who never raised his voice, never swore, but somehow managed to make bad news sound official enough to hurt. His voicemail came first. The recording was short, just 12 seconds long. His voice was calm but clipped, with that edge that only shows up when lawyers are trying not to panic. "Clara, call me as soon as you get this. This just got bad." That was it. No explanation, no details, just those 4 words, flat and final. I set the phone down and stared at it. The little red notification light blinked once, then went still. Bad for who, I wondered. I stood, stretched, and walked to the kitchen. The sky outside was still pale, the streets quiet. It was Christmas morning. Somewhere out there, people were waking up to gifts, cinnamon rolls, and laughter. Somewhere, families were hugging. Mine was probably shouting. I filled the kettle, poured the water into the coffee press, and waited for it to bloom. The smell rose up, rich and grounding. I leaned against the counter, letting the steam hit my face. Feeling the stillness of the apartment, the phone buzzed again, this time with a text. "Walter, call me. It's urgent." I typed back one line. "I'm fine. What's happening?" The response came within seconds. "Your dad's trying to reverse your actions. He called the bank. The credit line is frozen. Payroll's blocked. Vendors are calling him nonstop. He's saying you acted illegally." I could almost picture it. The chaos unraveling in real time. The calls, the confusion, the disbelief when Dad realized I had pulled the one lever he didn't know existed. I texted back. Everything I did was within my legal rights. I followed the agreements. I was removed from the company, so I acted accordingly. He didn't reply right away. I poured my coffee and took it to the table. The first sip was strong and slightly bitter. It felt perfect. When the phone rang again, I picked it up. "Clara," Walter said, his voice steady but strained. "I've got your dad on one line and your mother on the other. They're both furious. He says you've sabotaged the business. He's threatening litigation." "I didn't sabotage anything," I said quietly. "I protected myself, you know that." "I know," he said, exhaling hard. "But he's not hearing it. He's saying you acted out of spite. He's saying this is revenge." I closed my eyes for a moment. "It's not revenge," I said. "He fired me, publicly. Removed me from every position. The credit line and license were under my name. I followed protocol, that's all." Walter didn't argue. I told him the same thing. He won't listen. "He never does," I said. He paused, the silence on the line stretching for a few seconds. "He's in shock," Walter said finally. "He thought you'd never actually walk away." He thought wrong. I could hear papers rustling on his end, maybe the sound of him taking notes. "He's trying to claim damages," he said, "but legally, he doesn't have much ground. You were within your rights to withdraw. You even warned me about this possibility years ago, remember?" "I remember," I said. Judith made sure everything was airtight. That name hung in the air for a moment. Judith, the lawyer who had seen this coming before anyone else did. Walter sighed. "Look, I'm not calling to argue," he said. "I just need you to be prepared. The fallout is going to get messy. There's already chatter among the staff. Vendors are nervous. Someone leaked part of the freeze notice." "I expected that," I said. He hesitated again. "Are you really okay?" I looked around my apartment, the warm light from the lamp, the quiet hum of the heater, the untouched gifts by the door. "I'm fine," I said. "Better than I've been in a long time." Walter didn't say anything for a few seconds, and when he spoke again, his voice had softened. "Clara," he said, "you did the right thing, legally, but emotionally, this might take a toll." I smiled faintly. "Walter, it already did. Years ago." He let out a slow breath. "Fair enough." I thanked him for calling, told him to keep me updated, and ended the call. The apartment fell quiet again. For a moment, I just sat there, phone still in my hand, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. I thought about what was happening miles away in Napa, the chaos of phones ringing, Mom trying to smooth things over with her brittle charm, Caleb pacing around pretending to help. David barked orders to people who didn't know what to do. I could imagine the look on his face when Walter told him he had no legal power to undo what I'd done. The disbelief, the anger, the certainty that he could still control everything. He would call again, probably all day, but I wouldn't answer. I opened my email instead. There were dozens of messages from Vineyard staff. Some are polite, some panicked, some pleading for clarity. I didn't reply to any of them. I wasn't their boss anymore. I wasn't their problem. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the warmth spread through my hands. The quiet felt like something sacred now, like a privilege I had never allowed myself before. When the phone rang again, I flipped it over, letting the screen face down on the table. The vibration buzzed against the wood for a few seconds, then stopped. I didn't check who it was. Instead, I went to the window. The sky had cleared a little. The rain had stopped. A few children were playing on the sidewalk below, their laughter cutting through the stillness of the morning. Across someone's window glowed with the flicker of Christmas lights. I thought about how different this Christmas was from every other one I'd do. Known. No rushing. No pretending. Not trying to earn a place I had always been denied. Just me, my coffee, and a quiet morning that finally belonged to no one else. I turned back to the table, picked up the phone, and opened Walter's last text. This just got bad. I typed one reply. For them, maybe. Not for me. Then I set the phone face down again, walked to the kitchen, and poured. The sound of it filling the mug was the only noise in the room. I took a sip, leaned against the counter, and let the warmth spread through me. For the first time in my adult life, Christmas morning wasn't about fixing what someone else had broken. It was about. The morning stretched on quietly. I finished my second cup of coffee, took a long shower, and stood by the window as sunlight began to push through the gray. The city outside looked calm in a way that didn't match the chaos I knew was unfolding in Napa. Every few minutes, my phone buzzed on the counter, but I ignored it. I had no more explanations to give. By noon, I had eaten a late breakfast and started cleaning the kitchen. More out of restlessness than purpose. That was when my phone rang again, this time with a name I hadn't seen in months. Judith Carver. For a second, I froze. The last time we spoke, I was sitting in her office, signing documents I never thought I'd use. I hesitated, then answered. Her voice was calm but deliberate, the same tone she used when she had something serious to say. Clara, she said, I've been trying to reach you since last night. You haven't picked up. I've been busy, I said quietly, or maybe just done being available. There was a short pause. I understand, she said, but you need to hear this. It's important. I sat down at the table, the mug still warm in my hand. Go ahead. She took a breath before she spoke again. Your family has been in talks to sell Whitmore Ridge Cellars. They've been negotiating for several months. A private group out of Sonoma Valley was preparing to purchase the property for $9.6 million. I didn't move. 9.6? I repeated. Yes, she said. It's a full acquisition. The land, the assets, the brand, everything. But here's where it gets complicated. They structured the sale to exclude you entirely. No profit share, no payout, nothing. Her voice softened slightly, but there was no hesitation in her words. They intentionally left your name off every document. No mention of your financial contributions, no record of your guarantees. They filed it under a new operating entity, one created without your authorization. I stared at the wall, feeling the words sink in slowly, one by one. They were planning to sell it right before the end of the fiscal year, she continued. That's why your father wanted you out. He needed to terminate your connection to the business before closing the sale. But he made a mistake. I swallowed hard. What mistake? Judith's voice dropped lower, measured. The purchase agreement includes a retention clause. It names you as a key personnel member for a 12-month transition period. It requires your continued employment as part of the sale's stability guarantee. The clause was designed to assure investors that the operational lead would remain during the handover. By firing you before the transaction closed, Your father invalidated that term. The deal is now frozen. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the coffee in front of me. So, I said slowly, they tried to sell the vineyard, and in doing so, they accidentally killed their own deal. Yes, Judith said. Technically, the buyers could renegotiate, but it will take months. The valuation will drop. The investors may walk away, and without the active credit line and license, they have no legal framework to operate in the meantime. It's effectively stalled. The silence on the line stretched for a moment. I could hear her shifting papers, the faint click of her pen. They were willing to sell it all, she said finally. Even you. Those words hit harder than I expected. I felt the air leave my chest in a quiet exhale. I shouldn't be surprised, I said, my voice almost steady. I've watched them trade loyalty for pride my whole life. Judith hesitated, as if weighing what to say next. Clara, I've worked with hundreds of family-owned businesses. I've seen greed, negligence, entitlement. But what your father did, this wasn't just about money. It was about erasure. He wanted you gone from the narrative. I felt that truth sink deep, colder than anger, sharper than grief. Erasure. He hadn't just fired me. He had tried to erase me from the story completely. From the vineyard, from the brand, from the legacy. How long have they been planning this? I asked quietly. Since early summer, she said. Around June, they retained separate counsel, moved assets under a holding company called Ridge Legacy Partners. They created new accounts, new branding drafts, new contracts. Everything was prepared to close in mid-January. And they never told me. No, she said. You weren't meant to know until it was done. I stared at the far wall for a long time, my hands resting around the cooling mug. The apartment felt heavier suddenly, the quiet not so comforting anymore. Judith's voice softened again. What you did yesterday, freezing the credit, revoking the license, it didn't just protect you, it protected the business from being sold out from under you. That sale can't go forward legally. You stopped it, Clara. I felt something twist inside me. It wasn't satisfying. It wasn't revenge. It was clear. They thought I was destroying something, I said slowly, but I was just stopping them from giving it away. Yes, Judith said simply. That's exactly what you did. The quiet stretched again. They'll come after me, I said finally. Probably, she admitted. Your father will try to make this about loyalty, about betrayal, but legally, he has no ground to stand on. Every action you took was within the framework of your authority. You executed pre-authorized protections. You can prove it. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I'm not afraid of that part, I said. What hurts isn't what they did. It's how easily they did it. Judith was silent for a long moment. That's always the hardest part, she said quietly. Realizing what they were capable of before they even thought you'd find out. Her words hung in the air, heavy and true. We spoke a little longer about logistics. She promised to handle communication with the buyers and banks directly, to keep me updated if anything changed. Before hanging up, she said something that stayed with me long after the call ended. Clara, she said, you may feel like you lost something, but I promise you this. You're finally free from people who only valued what you could fix. Don't mistake that loss for emptiness. I thanked her quietly and ended the call. The apartment was silent again. Outside, the city had woken up. Cars passed on the street below, people walking dogs, the faint sound of laughter drifting from somewhere down the block. It felt like a different world entirely from the one I had left behind. I stood and walked to the window. The sunlight hit the floor in long, thin lines. I watched it move slowly across the table, touching the edge of Judith's folders still lying there. I traced a finger along the paper. The same documents that had once made me feel guilty now looked like salvation. I walked back to the kitchen, poured myself another cup of coffee, and leaned against the counter. $9.6 million. That was the number they had chosen. The price for everything we had built, every memory, every season of work. They were willing to sell the land, the name, the history. And in the process, they were willing to sell me out completely. I tried to imagine the conversation when they decided to do it. Dad explained how it was necessary for the future. Mom nodded, pretending it was all for the family's good. Caleb agreed, relieved at the thought of a payout that required no effort. I wondered if they even hesitated before leaving my name off. Probably not. I set the cup down and watched the sound of the city. They had planned to move on without me. But what they didn't realize was that they had built their escape route on the very foundation I had kept alive. They had made a move, but they made it too late. The morning light grew brighter, spilling across the floor, catching the edges of the folder, the laptop, the phone. I stood there for a long time, letting the truth settle quietly into place. That was the move I stopped. This time, the problem wasn't something I could fix. It was something I had stopped. The rain kept falling through the night, tapping against the window in a slow, steady rhythm. I sat there for a long time, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the faint city lights outside. My thoughts came in waves, some calm, some heavy, all circling back to the same realization. For years, my entire existence had been measured by my usefulness. The vineyard, the family, the endless cycle of being the one who solved the problems no one else wanted to acknowledge. Every role I played, every decision I made, every apology I swallowed, it all led to this moment. The stillness after the storm. I wasn't sure yet what came next, but for once, not knowing didn't scare me. Around 9, my phone buzzed again, vibrating across the table. I ignored it at first, but when it didn't stop, I finally turned it over. A string of new messages from Caleb lit up the screen. The first one was short. "What did you do?" The next came a minute later. "Dad's losing it. Payroll's locked, the sale's dead. You've got to fix this before it gets worse." Then another. "Clara, just call him, please. You don't understand what's happening." I stared at the words, feeling that familiar pull of obligation. The reflex to respond, to de-escalate, to smooth over chaos. For a brief second, my thumb hovered over the keyboard. But then I remembered Dad's voice from earlier. Sharp, cold, dismissive. "You're nothing without us." And suddenly, it was easy to set the phone back down. I wasn't going to fix this one. A few minutes later, another text appeared, this time from Mom. Her messages came in bursts, full of the same pleading tone as before. "Your father didn't mean it. You know how he gets when he's angry. Please don't do this. This family has been through enough." Followed by another. "We can figure something out. You're overreacting. It's just business." Just business. The words made me laugh softly, though there was no humor in it. For them, everything had always been just business. Every betrayal, every dismissal, every silence excused by practicality. They could justify anything if it meant keeping their version of control. I walked to the kitchen, refilled my glass with water, and leaned against the counter. Outside, the rain had turned to mist, blurring the edges of the streetlights. That was when I realized what Judith had meant earlier. This wasn't just about legal protection or money. It was about taking back the narrative, about refusing to be written out of my own life. For years, my father had been the author of our story. The proud patriarch, the visionary, the man whose name was printed on every bottle of wine as if the land itself had grown under his command. Mom played the gracious hostess, Caleb the charming heir, and me? I was the invisible spine that held the story upright, the part no one ever saw. But without it, nothing stood. They thought removing me from the picture would make the story cleaner, easier to sell. Instead, they had pulled out the very structure that made it possible to stand in them. First place. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a voicemail notification. I didn't recognize the number, but curiosity got the better of me. When I played it, I heard Walter's voice. "Clara? It's Walter. Your father's here at my office. He's demanding I file an injunction to reverse the credit freeze. I told him he doesn't have a case, but he's not listening. He's furious, to put it lightly. He's also accusing Judith of conspiring with you, which, for the record, I find ridiculous. Anyway, I just thought you should know what's happening on his end. Take care of yourself, okay?" The message ended with a small sigh. The sound of a man who had seen too many families eat themselves alive over money. I deleted it without saving it. Dad would rage. Mom would plead. Caleb would blame me. The cycle was predictable. I knew every step of it. But this time, I wasn't stepping into it. I wasn't playing my part. The clock on the wall ticked quietly, the only sound in the apartment. I made another cup of tea, wrapped both hands around it, and sat down again. The steam curled up in front of me, catching the light. The vineyard flashed in my mind. The rolling hills, the smell of the soil after rain, the hum of the irrigation system I once saved with my own money. I could almost see the sunlight on the vines, the small details that no sale contract could capture. I had loved that place once, not for what it represented, but for what it could have been, a real legacy, something built on care and consistency. But love wasn't enough to save it from the people who refused to value it. Now they would have to face the consequences of that blindness. Hours passed quietly. I cooked a small dinner and sat by the window again, the lights of the city glimmering below. Somewhere between exhaustion and calm, I felt a strange mix of grief and liberation. Grief for what could have been. Liberation for what would never be again. Then, just before midnight, my phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Dad or Mom or Caleb. It was Judith. I answered on the first ring. "Clara," she said, her tone steady but edged with urgency. "I have an update." I straightened slightly. "What happened?" "Your father just tried to initiate a bridge loan using the vineyard's assets as collateral," she said. "The bank flagged it because your authorization was missing. He's claiming you froze the accounts out of malice. The bank called me to verify." I let out a small breath. "And what did you tell them?" "That everything you did was pre-authorized. Under the guarantor withdrawal clause," she said. "They understood immediately. But I thought you should know he's getting desperate. He's calling everyone he can." "I figured he would," I said quietly. Judith paused. "You did the right thing, Clara. Don't doubt that now. If you had hesitated even a few hours longer, the sale might have gone through." There was silence for a moment, the kind that carried weight, but also understanding. "I'm not doubting myself," I said finally. "I just wish it didn't have to be this way." Her voice softened. "It almost always does." We talked for a few more minutes about logistics, about what to expect in the coming weeks. She promised to handle communication with the financial institutions and to document every interaction. When we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at the reflection of the city lights in the dark window. David's voice echoed faintly in my head from our earlier conversation. "You're nothing without us." But looking around my apartment, the soft glow of the lamp, the scent of tea, the quiet space that belonged entirely to me, I realized he had been wrong. I had built this life, piece by piece, out of everything they never gave me: stability, integrity, peace. They could have had all of it if they had chosen honesty. Instead, they chose greed, and I chose freedom. By 1 a.m, the rain had stopped completely. I opened the window, letting in the cool air. The scent of wet pavement filled the room. Somewhere far off, a church bell rang, marking the hour. I sat there listening to it fade, feeling the kind of calm that comes only after a long storm has finally passed. There would be fallout, of course. There always was, but I wasn't afraid of it anymore. For years, I had built my identity around holding everything together. Now, for the first time, I was learning what it meant to let things fall apart, and to trust that I would still stand when they did. I closed the window, turned off the lights, and stood for a moment in the dark, looking around the room. It felt lighter somehow, like the air itself had shifted. They thought they could sell the vineyard, the family, the legacy, all without me. But they forgot one simple thing. None of it could exist without the person who made it work. And now, it wouldn't. The phone sat silent on the table. I didn't turn it back on. I didn't need to. The chaos could unfold without my participation. I walked to my bedroom, slipped under the covers, and closed my eyes. The last thought that crossed my mind before sleep came was quiet and certain. They thought I was the problem. But I had only ever been the foundation, and now they were learning what it felt like to stand without one. Time, as it always does, began to smooth the sharp edges of everything that had happened. The storm that followed my decision eventually slowed, though it left wreckage scattered across what used to be home. I didn't look for updates, but the news found its way to me anyway. Small notes through old contacts, quiet mentions from people who still worked in Napa's wine circuit. Mittmore Ridge Cellars was sold the following spring, not for $9.6 million, Not even for $4.2 million. That was all it was worth by the time the contracts cleared. Years of history, soil, and family pride. Reduced to a number smaller than some houses in the Bay Area. They lost the main property. The buyers rebranded it under a new name. The Whitmore Ridge label disappeared from shelves within months. I didn't cry when I heard. I didn't even flinch. I only remember sitting quietly, staring out the window of my office in San Jose, watching the morning sun rise over the city. Somewhere deep down, I think I had already mourned it long before the papers were signed. Caleb left Napa soon after. One of our old vendors told me he moved to Portland, working at a small marketing firm. "He's keeping a low profile," she said. "People don't mention the vineyard anymore." I thanked her, then changed the subject. Mom stayed behind with Dad for a while, but by late 2024, she had quietly moved in with her sister near Sacramento. I learned that through Judith, who still handled some residual legal filings related to my name. "Your mother sends short notes," Judith said. "Nothing dramatic. Just polite updates, like she's still pretending everything is normal." That sounded exactly like her. And Dad? He never called again. Not once. The last thing I heard was that he'd been forced to sell the old house to cover remaining debts. The property tax alone had become too much after the vineyard folded. The home I grew up in, the one I used to decorate every Christmas, the one with the oak tree that scraped against my bedroom window, was gone. I'd thought that revelation would hurt more than it did, but instead it felt strangely peaceful, like a final chapter closing itself without my help. The part of me that had once longed for his approval had finally gone silent. Life after that was quiet, structured, ordinary. I started working for a company in San Jose in early 2025. It was nothing glamorous, but it was honest work. Numbers, systems, strategy, things that didn't lie. People spoke directly. Deadlines meant something. I wasn't responsible for anyone's emotional well-being, only the math. I rented a small apartment downtown, high enough to see the city lights at night, but low enough to still hear the hum of traffic below. It was my kind of place. Neat, quiet, self-contained. I bought new furniture for the first time in years, picked out art I liked without worrying if anyone else approved. There were no family photos on the walls. No signs of a past life, only the calm neutrality of starting over. My coworkers didn't know much about my old life, and I didn't volunteer. They just knew me as Clara, the numbers person, who stayed late but never looked tired. Someone once asked me how I kept so calm during chaos, and I smiled. "Practice," I said. That spring, Judith came to visit while attending a conference nearby. We had dinner together in a small restaurant that overlooked the bay. She looked at me across the table, her eyes soft with pride. "You look lighter," she said. "Freer." "I feel it," I said. "For the first time in years, I sleep without thinking about what's waiting in my inbox." She smiled. "That's how you know you made the right choice, when peace replaces exhaustion." We talked for hours about work, travel, everything except the vineyard. When we finally stood to leave, she touched my shoulder gently. "You didn't just save yourself, Clara," she said. "You broke a cycle that would have kept repeating. That's harder than people realize." Her words stayed with me long after we said goodbye. That December, my second Christmas after everything, I took a few days off work and stayed home. No big plans, no expectations. I made dinner for myself. Something simple but comforting. The city outside was quiet, soft rain misting over the streets, just like that night 2 years ago, when it had all begun. I sat by the window with a glass of wine, a bottle from a small Sonoma label I'd grown fond of. The candlelight flickered against the glass, and the air smelled faintly of rosemary and lemon from the chicken roasting in the oven. For the first time in my adult life, Christmas didn't hurt. It didn't feel lonely either. Just still. I thought about Dad, not with anger, but with a strange kind of compassion. He had spent his whole life trying to control the world around him, too afraid to admit that he couldn't. Maybe that was his version of survival. Maybe, in his mind, power was the only way to feel safe. I didn't forgive him, not in the sense that I wanted reconciliation, but I stopped needing him to be. Anything else? Sometimes acceptance isn't about making peace with the person. It's about making peace with the truth. Mom sent a Christmas card again that year. Her handwriting was a little shakier, but the message was the same. Hope you're doing well. We're fine.
David's been quieter lately.
I hope life is good for you. Merry Christmas. I placed the card in a drawer and left it there. I didn't feel guilty.
I didn't feel relieved.
Just a quiet understanding that not every story needs a sequel. That night, I sat down at my desk and looked through old files on my laptop. In one folder, I found an old budget spreadsheet labeled 2019 Vineyard Audit. The notes were meticulous. My notes. Every figure cross-checked. Every detail color-coded. At the time, I'd made it to protect them. Now, it reads like a record of everything I'd endured. 6 years of unpaid hours, unacknowledged work, invisible loyalty. I closed the file without saving. Sometimes closure isn't about looking back. It's about knowing you can. Later that night, I stepped out onto the small balcony of my apartment. The rain had stopped. The air was cold but clean, carrying that faint metallic scent after a storm. Lights shimmered on the wet pavement below, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. It was Christmas again, but this time, it belonged entirely to me. I leaned on the railing, breathing in the quiet. For a long time, I had thought cutting my family off meant destroying something sacred. Now I understand it was the opposite. I hadn't destroyed anything. I had preserved what little of myself they hadn't managed to take. Freedom didn't come from revenge or payback. It came from silence, from choosing to stop explaining, stop fixing, stop waiting for an apology that would never come. I didn't hate my father. I didn't love him either. What I felt was something beyond both, an acknowledgement of the past, without letting it define the future. As midnight neared, I turned off the lights inside and let the glow from the city wash over me. The noise, the hum, the life. It all felt bigger than the small world I had once tried so desperately to fit into. I thought about the women who might be listening to my story someday, those who had been told they were too demanding, too sensitive, too independent, too much. The ones who kept families running, businesses alive, relationships intact, while being treated like background noise. I wanted them to know what I had finally learned. Leaving isn't betrayal. Sometimes it's the truest form of love. Love for yourself. I went back inside, blew out the candle, and sat for a moment in the stillness. If you've ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you're listening from.